Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. I was reading a book recently that claimed up to 90% of the decisions we make are unconscious. If you want to really reach people, if you want to communicate with them, if you want to persuade them, you need to figure out how to talk to that unconscious part of their mind. I don't know about you, but I frequently hear statements like this. The number varies, but the idea is always the same. Much of our everyday behavior is affected by all sorts of unconscious influences. But is this true? And where does the idea come from, and how in the world would you go about measuring it? With me to discuss these questions today is David Shanks, Professor of Psychology and Deputy Dean of Brain Sciences at UCL. Welcome to Changing Minds, David.
Hi, Joe.
I'm glad you could join us. Thank you. Before we get started, I'd just like to invite our audience to share any questions you have for David in the Q&A board. And feel free to do it as we go along, so that by the end, when we get a chance to go to questions, there are a few there that we can just start to jump right into. So David, if it's okay with you, I guess I'd like to start by asking, what does it mean for something to unconsciously influence our behavior?
Yes, that's an obvious place to start, Joe. And without spending hours on the philosophy behind all this, I think it's important just to think about two things that psychologists normally have in mind when they talk about unconscious and conscious control of behavior. One is something to do with our intentions. I can blink my eye intentionally, but often I do it unintentionally. My brain tells my eyelid to blink for reasons that I have very little knowledge of, but I can do it intentionally. So some things are controllable, to do with our ability to exert influence on our behaviors. So that's one dimension, control. The other dimension is something to do with reportability or introspection or insight. It's our capacity for perhaps describing why we've done something. The reason I blinked my eye was because you asked me to, and I wanted to prove that I could do it. These two dimensions sort of often overlap. We tend to think that we can report and articulate a bit more about the things that we can control. But often it's useful to think of those as two slightly different aspects of what we mean by consciousness.
And a lot of times when I hear people talking about this idea that 90% or whatever of our behavior is unconsciously influenced, they often refer to Danny Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Is that where the idea comes from?
Well, an incredibly influential piece of the jigsaw on this topic recently. Of course, people have been studying consciousness right back into the late 19th century, and then you have Freud and so on. Decades and decades of really interesting research. But there's no doubt that Kahneman's book, which was published about a decade ago, I think, was really interesting. Kahneman is a massive, massive figure in our field, a proper genius, and wrote this really influential book about decision making. I think he probably now regrets the weight that he put in the book on a body of evidence that has turned out to be much, much weaker than he and everybody else had hoped. I mean, particularly around studies of what are called priming influences, a little bit like nudging influences, studies which seem to demonstrate that quite subtle signals or cues around us can influence our behavior. And you can think of something like the scent in a store affecting your decision to buy something. I mean, if such an effect were real, you could think of that, call that a priming effect. And Kahneman in his book wrote an entire chapter about these priming effects and how they indicate that mental concepts can be very subtly activated outside of awareness, and having been activated can then influence the decisions and judgments that we make. And he built all this into this quite well-known distinction between system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is the unconscious, rather emotional, intuitive part of the decision-making system, and system 2 is the much more rational part, which can occasionally come in and kind of correct errors and biases that system 1 produces. So what happened after the book was published is that, I mean, many people will be aware that the last decade or so, we've had a lot of scrutiny of the ways in which behavioral researchers carry out their studies. And we've discovered that often people take part in sort of fishing expeditions of their data, and they use statistical techniques that are not very justifiable, and they do 10 studies and they publish the 6 that have nice results, and then they bury the 4 that don't. When the dust settles, you find that quite a lot of the effects that Kahneman was relying on, and that others also had taken great heed of in theory development, turned out to be really difficult to reproduce. So yes, Kahneman himself has backtracked a little, and whether he's writing the follow-up to Thinking Fast and Slow, I don't know, but I think if he is, it'll definitely have a different flavor to it.
That seems like such an important point, because I feel like a lot of times when something cool comes out in psychology or neuroscience, there's almost a rush to try to exploit it without maybe doing all the necessary boring science to check how valid and easy it is to reproduce, and what are the borderline conditions. And of course that leads to a lot of wasted effort, but also really it leads down these garden paths of incorrect directions. Is that something that you've run across?
Yeah, sadly, yes. And I think everybody in behavioral research is encountering examples of this. One that's been really prominent in work on unconscious influences, an example of priming, is called money priming. And this is a very cool idea. I mean, it's the idea that subtle suggestions about money can change people's behavior. For example, making them more selfish, making them work harder on difficult tasks. And money priming was first published in the premier journal in the whole of science, namely the journal Science, in 2006, and reporting some positive findings, and then was followed by more positive findings, and gradually grew into this industry about money priming. And people then started asking all sorts of questions. Does it happen in children? Does it, all kinds of questions, probing the details of this. But at the same time, other people were trying to reproduce these results and discovering that they were having difficulty. And can I just share my screen with you, Joe, and show you a neat figure on money priming? So I hope you can see that, maybe.
Yes.
So this is a figure. So every dot here is a money priming experiment, and basically what's being done in these experiments, you have an experimental condition and a control condition. So in the experimental condition, a group of participants will be given a money prime, given some subtle indication of money, and participants in the control group won't. And then you measure some behavior. They're given an opinion measurement survey, or they take part in some task and you measure how hard they work on the task, a range of different things. But in effect, you look to see whether you get a difference between the experimental group and the control group. And if I was to come down here, you can see my pointer. These were the original demonstrations done by Kathleen Vose and her colleagues. And what's shown on the y-axis here is just the magnitude of the difference between the experimental group and the control group. So the fact that all of these points here are greater than 0 means that these early studies were showing a positive money priming effect. And all this graph shows is what happens as more and more experiments, indeed hundreds of experiments, started to accumulate after the original report. And there's a couple of kind of noteworthy things here. One is that there's a downward trend, that people were getting successful money priming effects less and less frequently. And if you look at these lines, these sort of dotted lines, that best fitting lines, you can extrapolate forward and say that, well, probably money priming is going to disappear in about 2021. So it's just getting hard. So somehow or other, those initial reports were probably spurious. They were probably the results of a little bit of fishing, some lucky results that the authors published, and maybe they had some less successful ones that they didn't publish. There's a couple of other interesting things here. So the orange dots or the red dots are for studies that were published, and the blue ones are for unpublished studies. So the group that put this meta-analysis together went to huge efforts to contact researchers and ask them to provide information about their unpublished studies. And you can see that indeed the unpublished studies in blue dots yield much smaller effects than the ones that end up being published. So what we read about in our scientific journals is not a true reflection of reality. It's a filtered reflection of just the things that happen to show a particular kind of outcome. And now, of course, more recently, we now know that there's something that's much closer to being a sort of gold standard for doing research in behavioral sciences, and that's to pre-register our plan for our research. So what we do now is have a really detailed description of the whole experiment and how we're going to analyze the data and so on. And we make that description public, sort of in a time-stamped way, before we even start collecting data. And that means that we're really tying our own hands in terms of the ways in which we can fish in the data subsequently to get a result that we might want. And in this body of work, there are now nearly 50 pre-registered experiments, and on average, those show no money priming effect. So you can see that when you aggregate large amounts of evidence on these kind of apparently cool little unconscious influences on behavior, they often turn out to be a little bit disappointing.
Right. Well, and that's what drug companies do, right? I mean, it's more important that they're not selectively saying, this study shows that our drug is really effective, you should buy it. They actually have to pre-register in order to guarantee that some of these biases are minimized.
You look at the history of the research on the drug fluoxetine, Prozac,
right.
Its utility is far weaker than the original studies indicated.
I think that's really interesting because even for psychological studies like money priming or others that don't have a direct influence on your health, but then there are companies and groups that are out trying to use this. They have campaigns going. They're devoting effort and resources into trying to implement these things to influence our behavior. That's all potentially wasted material, right? I mean, so it does have an important effect in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, some of these effects are probably real, but maybe much, much smaller than we tend to think. So think about the example I gave before about scents in shops. I mean, a recent big meta-analysis of that field, hundreds of studies, it shows that the effect on people's spending was about 3%, and that effect was not statistically significant. So, it's 3%, we need to do more research and find out whether that's a real 3% or just a bit of random noise.
And would you say that something like that was an unconscious influence? Because for me and you, I mean, we're talking about it, our audiences here, they're probably well aware that the bakery's by the front door of the grocery store.
That's right.
However,
I think that the menu example is a good one for that. I mean, so where you position something on a menu, or indeed where you position a product on a web page, it can be at the top of a search or further down a search. These certainly influence our behavior. But if you ask people why they might pick the item that's at the top or the bottom of a menu list, they will often give you a perfectly good reason why they do that. First of all, they're aware that the position on the menu is influencing the behavior, and they'll say that they think that the restaurant or the seller is signaling something by the position that they use.
Right.
There's nothing irrational necessarily about being influenced in subtle ways by these contextual factors.
I know that you've also done some work on another one of these priming things that's really influential, this idea that sex sells. Can you tell us a little bit
Yes.
about what you've done and what you found?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at a body of research which suggests that particularly young males are influenced by sexual or romantic signals around them. I mean, that sounds so obvious, doesn't it? And the particular issue that we were looking at was the claim that romantic signals make young males more willing to take risks. You think, young male syndrome is actually a real phenomenon. Young males do things that they would often regret, and it's not hard to see that sometimes trying to impress the opposite sex, for instance, may be part of the motivation for that. We looked at, there's again a large body of research on this. We found that it was impossible to reproduce these effects. They're just not real at all.
Wow, so draping a model over the picture of the, Mercedes or whatever, which is a typical thing to do, really doesn't seem to have any particular influence on that?
The effects are much harder to document than you would imagine.
Wow.
Now, maybe, Joe, what I should just comment on is, something that perhaps many people will have heard of, unconscious bias, and in particular, the IAT, the implicit association test. This is, an enormous industry in its own right. The IAT is a very clever test for apparently measuring our unconscious attitudes, whether that's attitudes to, for example, other ethnic groups, or attitudes to products, whatever it might be. And the kind of narrative that we're given around the IAT is that it's a way of measuring those unconscious attitudes that we have that are completely, below the waterline as far as our awareness is concerned. Actually, there's a huge amount of controversy about the IAT, and people can, for example, people can fake IAT responses. If you ask somebody to behave like a racially prejudiced individual, or indeed like a completely racially unprejudiced individual, they can do that. They can manipulate their IAT behavior. People can predict what their own behavior will be in an IAT. And most crucially, I think, this is a sort of proof is in the pudding issue. Is there any evidence that measuring these unconscious attitudes helps us to explain behavior over and above what we would do if we just measured somebody's conscious attitudes? And there, the jury is really out on that. There are very, very few convincing examples of where having some measure of an unconscious attitude gives an increment to what we can predict above knowing the conscious attitude. Lots of controversy around all of these areas.
Sorry, I live under the flight path to Heathrow, which hasn't been an issue up till now, but right at the moment, it seems to be a little bit more active. So that's fascinating. So really, the issue here seems to be around this conscious-unconscious distinction, because the IAT example you gave sort of defeats both of the definitions of unconscious, right? You can control it, and you're also essentially aware of it. At least you can be.
Yeah, you can be. Yeah.
That's
right. And another thing I think that, again, I come back to proof in the pudding here. You think about people in marketing or brand management or whatever. You go and have a look at the classic textbook on brand management by Kevin Keller. It's a huge, fantastic book about all the ways in which companies have discovered that they can manage their brands. Go and look in the index. There's nothing in the index about unconscious measures of behavior or about the implicit association test. There is just no evidence that these things have filtered through in any meaningful way into companies' techniques that they can effectively use, and that I think is quite telling.
Well, that might be the perfect place to sort of stop and open it up to audience questions. Let me pop up the Q&A board. Now I can see there's a ton of questions here already. Is the first question is a really good one, and it comes up a lot. Is there a difference here between unconscious and subconscious?
I think, people have all sorts of different uses of these with pre-conscious as well. In actual fact, there's no agreed definitions of these terms, and really people tend to use them very interchangeably. Subliminal, supraliminal is another type of subliminal meaning, something that is, for instance, flashed so briefly that you're not even aware that you've seen it. But I think my answer to that question would be, if you're hoping for definitional clarity in this field, I think you may be disappointed.
Right. Well, you see that's a lot in logos, right? There are these clever logos that have, UPS has an arrow built in, or Toblerone has a bear, and that's supposed to be an example of these unconscious or subconscious influences. Yeah, it's a really clever logo.
Very subtle. Yeah. No, right. They are often really clever, and they evoke associations that might have downstream, consequences, make you feel a little bit warmer towards the product, and so on and so forth. Is that unconscious? That needs probing.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, so let me turn to another question. It says here, digital companies utilize these priming effects too. How do these kind of spurious findings on priming, translate into the digital domain? So I guess this is referring to the fact that companies are doing a lot of split half or A/B testing, and they're using these results, right?
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, I'd love to see some of the data, and if these A/B tests are done really well, you could get such an enormous amount of data. I mean, it could be brilliant to find an example where some subtle digital prime actually does robustly affect behavior. And as far as the company is concerned, that's probably all they care about. But for a behavioral scientist like me, I would then like to actually quiz the participants and probe them and find out a little bit more about, what's really motivating their behavior. Can they introspect on this? I think if they can, I mean, the company would probably like to know that, because it gives some rationalization for the individual's behavior. But you might find that, perhaps some of these influences truly are unconscious.
That actually sounds like exactly the kind of academic corporate partnership research program that would be really valuable, because, as you say, it would be useful for the companies to know. And I had a PhD student who worked at Virgin Media, and they got over 1 million hits on their webpage a week, and he was doing digital A/B testing. And I remember having just serious data jealousy, the number of experiments that they can run with good N in advance.
Yes. Yeah, that's fantastic. So a good example of that would be framing effects, which Adam gave a talk on quite recently, didn't he? The way in which you frame a particular decision in a sort of positive frame or a negative frame. Now, that's really the kind of thing that a company would care about. Frames hugely affect behavior. Actually, Kahneman,
another chapter,
one of the earliest discoverers of that. But we now have a range of methods for probing people's intuitions about the effects of frames on their behavior. And those methods are showing that people often understand why the frame matters and why it should influence their behavior. So those kind of techniques could be rolled out much more widely. It would be great.
There are a couple of people who are asking questions about the sort of 95% figure, right? This idea that 95% of your decision-making is unconsciously influenced. Any idea where that comes from, and if there is a true figure?
No, I mean, my view would be that there's so many imponderables in this whole area, so many questions that we still have to address. That try, even if it meant something to put a number on it, I think we're miles away from being able to do that. And I mean, I think once you start asking what exactly does that mean, whether the number is 90% or 60% or whatever, what exactly do you mean by that? I think not sure that would really stand up to a great deal of academic scrutiny. It's quite good as a little sort of catchphrase.
Yeah, it's a great tagline. It gets a lot of attention.
Yeah.
There's another question here that I think is really good, and it's sort of a theme we've addressed sometimes in this webinar series, which is around individual differences. Is there any evidence that people vary in terms of how much they're influenced or affected by these kind of framing effects, priming, etc.?
Yeah, no, that's a really nice question. I mean, yes, like everything else, human behavior is susceptible to enormous individual differences. There are sort of questionnaires and tests that you can use, for example, to place somebody on a scale that you might think of as something to do with intuition. You know, some people are more intuitive and some people are more kind of analytical. And some of those scales are reasonably reliable. I mean, if you give people the same test twice, they'll come up more or less with the same sort of score. The problem is that you don't tend to see much association between those scales and other interesting aspects of behavior. They don't tend to capture, as far as we know, any very generalizable aspects of behavior. But it's yet another area where, you know, more and more data, and particularly large sample data, would be really interesting.
And do you think that this is more of a time effect? Like the graph that you showed us, obviously that was as more data accumulated, but there's also a sense that people are potentially become more aware, more educated of some of these effects. I'm thinking of like the literature on subliminal priming, for instance,
right.
You know, and brand placement in movies and TV shows.
Right, so the audience, the consumers, are themselves becoming more aware of these phenomena, and therefore less likely to demonstrate. You know, I mean, that has often been a speculation that some of the defenders of these priming effects have come up with to explain why their effects can't be reproduced. I'm not sure I buy that very much, although of course, you know, if you're aware that somebody is trying to influence you, that certainly will reflexively affect the way that you do indeed behave.
And another really interesting question about one of the measures that's often used in unconscious bias is anchoring, right? And the question is just, is anchoring also a spurious finding, or is that something that really affects behavior?
You know, we go back to Kahneman again, don't we? I mean, this is why he's such a genius. So, you know, anchoring is a massively real phenomenon. So if I could say to you, Joe, the World Wide Web was invented after 1978. When was it invented? What would you answer?
Right, 1988.
You'd be about right. Now, if I do that again and I say to you, the World Wide Web was invented before 1998, when was it invented?
Right.
Those numbers that I give will tend to influence your responses. And there's no doubt that is a genuine phenomenon. And you can even get that anchoring effect, even if people know that the anchor number is kind of randomly generated. So that's a real effect. However, I mean, we've done research showing that you don't get anchoring just from numbers that are irrelevant and you know, just appear in the context of the question. There is definitely a limit to the extent to which an anchor can influence your behavior, and you have to somehow engage with the number, think about the number in order to get an influence on your behavior.
Fascinating. I'm sensitive to the fact that we're running low on time. There are a ton more questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to them all. But it was, you know, really interesting topic. And, you know, I'd just like to thank you, David, for a stimulating and thought-provoking discussion.
Real pleasure, real pleasure.
Thank you very much. And everyone, I hope to see you here next week. Next Monday, we have another episode, and hopefully just as exciting and stimulating as today. Thanks again, everyone. So long.